Hello, thank you for checking this out. I wanted to do a recap of the second quarter and talk about our investments year to date and changes that have been recently made. I won't get into all the craziness of the year. We all know what's going on there. The markets have been a story of the haves and have-nots. So I wanted to review some of the statistical analysis from the first 6 months. You may have noticed the S&P 500 hasn't changed a whole lot. So you think, okay, maybe companies weren't all that affected. But really, the S&P was only down 3% through June 30th because of a handful of stocks that dominate its weight. And those stocks are stocks like Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, those kinds of companies. They were, went way up during this time. And so it kind of hid all of the other areas of the market that dropped. And what I mean by hid is if you look at the S&P 500 equal weight index, where every one of those 500 companies has an equal weighting, that index was down double digits year to date, 11%. If you look at the next couple thousand companies, the mid-cap market, that index was down 13%. The next several thousand companies, the small cap market, that index was down 18%. The time-tested high dividend, low volatility index was down 23% because it doesn't have the big tech names. REITs were down significantly, publicly traded REITs, not the ones that we own, the private non-traded, but publicly traded ones early and had somewhat of a recovery, but they were still down. The Dow was down about 9% year to date. We did have some write down on Blackstone's REIT because of their full service hotels, but that just offset some of last year's gains that we enjoyed. And the 2 prior years to that, it had gains. It's still paying its dividend. It has plenty of cash flow coverage on its dividends and doesn't intend to drop those. So I expect to see that come back at some point when things reopen. Internationally, global markets, excluding the U.S., were down 11%. Emerging markets were down 10%. And the high dividend, low volatility, foreign markets were down 17%. Commodities, including oil, metals, food, they were down 21%, but within that, gold was up, and I'll talk about gold in a minute here. Bonds were up slightly during this year because interest rates incredibly fell, even with all the borrowing that we just had. I don't think they can fall much more, but we'll keep our eye on that, but I don't intend to overweight bonds, although I had made some moves into that. We've already pulled out. The biggest losers in the sectors were energy down 35%, industrials down 15%, financials, including banks and insurance companies, were down 24%. So if we had a pretty broad market exposure globally, we would normally expect we'd be down double digits, but as you look at your portfolios, you'll see that you're not. And some of the reasons, obviously, for that was the earlier in the year short position we took, the reversal of the short position, the strategy of overweighting particular sectors of the market to have more in them and less in others. So the sectors that we overweighted were large cap large cap technology shares, such as those in the NASDAQ. So QQQ, that holding. We also overweighted semiconductors, and I overweighted healthcare, biotech, consumer staples. Later in the first half of the year, I moved some money out of areas that I thought were kind of suspect going forward post-COVID, put it into short-term bonds until we could figure out a direction on that. And recently I implemented some changes to that. I took the money out of the short-term bonds and looked at the different sectors and said, well, what do I think is really going to do well post-COVID? And obviously, technology shares. So I found another fund that concentrates on both how we pay for things and how business conducts business over the internet and over software. And so it has a heavy holding in Apple, Microsoft, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, and on the business applications, Salesforce and Cisco and those kinds of companies. So I thought that would be a good way to go. I added money to many of your portfolios into biotech again to overweight that for obvious reasons. And for the first time ever, I put some money into a precious metal, gold. And not because, gold's typically a fear asset, not because of that so much, but because of the study I did using Zacks Research, CKS. They're a huge research company I've been using to analyze the different subsectors. And they had some interesting charts on how gold responds when we increase our national debt dramatically. And it was always a positive response. And being a little defensive is not a bad idea. So I put some into that. And I think, it just makes sense to overweight those sectors of the economy that we think are going to outperform the rest of the economy and not just sit around with a broad market strategy. Broad market strategies like the S&P 500 have worked brilliantly for 11 years. They didn't work real good 12 years ago, but 2008, but brilliantly for the next 11. And I'm a little concerned with having all my money into broad markets. I'm not going to abandon that, but certainly drop down and be more sniper-like in how we invest in ETFs going forward. So I've gotten lots of great phone calls and emails from people that are feeling very grateful that our portfolios have not endured the carnage that a lot of portfolios have year to date, thanks to some of these moves, and hope to continue to stay up on that and react accordingly. I've never worked so hard in a year in my life, never done as much research or made as many changes. Some people have asked about that. Do you get paid when you make changes? No, I do not make more money, except indirectly, because if your account balances do better, obviously we do better too. So we're kind of in this together. So I thank you all for those of you that have shared your kind words and thoughts with me on that. Final notes, there's an election coming up, and I'm not going to tell you to vote for. It's not my job. I will say I'm concerned about some of the proposals about eliminating the step-up in basis and eliminating capital gains tax. I think capital gains tax is primarily a tax on inflation. If you buy something like a piece of land or a house, let's say 50 years ago, and later it's worth a lot more, you sell it. The house didn't grow, it didn't add another room or grab the lot next door. It's still the same house, it's just older and not as good. But because of inflation, it's worth a lot more, and you get taxed on that in many cases. And if that tax is very high, you basically are giving up an asset that didn't improve during that time period. There's also the step up in basis. If, let's say, grandma bought a house 50 years ago in Kirkland and went way up in value, wants to leave it to her kid, and before she's able to do that, she passes away. Generally, she could leave it at that point to her kid, but with the new laws, you can't do that if you take away the step up in basis. So that's another issue that I'm going to keep my eye on. Income tax rates going forward could go way up because of all the money we just borrowed. So certainly if you want to talk about strategies on Roth conversions or fixed index universal life policies that provide for growth over years and years and years, and you'll never pay that back in income tax, we can talk to you about that. Well, thanks for sitting through all my statistical analysis and talk on this. Just want to keep you all up to date on where we're at. I feel very good about the portfolios and how they've responded to this COVID crisis. And as you look at your second quarter statements, you'll understand why I make that statement. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and thanks for listening.